Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. This morning, we will have the same witness at both parts of our meeting. He will be testifying first on his 2008-2009 report, the report of the Commissioner of Official Languages that was referred to the committee last Tuesday, and then he will be speaking about post-secondary institutions and their efforts in promoting bilingualism in Canada. So with no further delay, I'll ask the Commissioner, after welcoming him, welcome on behalf of all the members, I'll ask him to give us his opening remarks. Parliamentarians.
Good morning. To present the findings of my third annual report, I am accompanied by Joanne Tremblay, Acting Assistant Commissioner of Policy and Communications, Gisèle Charlebois, Assistant Commissioner of Compliance Assurance, Pascal Giguère, Attorney and Acting Director of Legal Affairs, and Lise Cloutier, Assistant Commissioner, Corporate Services. La loi sur les langues officielles célèbre ses 40 ans cette année. Manifestement, les parlementaires qui ont œuvré à son élaboration, menant à sa sanction royale en 1969, étaient des visionnaires. Cet encadrement législatif était absolument nécessaire pour l'avenir du pays. Comme balise importante, les garanties linguistiques contenues dans la Charte canadienne des droits et libertés ont appuyé la révision de la loi sur les langues officielles. Les avantages qui en ont découlé sont nombreux sur le plan des droits de la personne, de la culture.
In terms of human rights, culture, workforce mobility, and the economy. They benefit all Canadians, regardless of their mother tongue. Nonetheless, the time has come to eliminate the roadblocks and contradictions related to the implementation of Canada's language policy and to attain a certain level of coherence between various government policies, programs, and initiatives.
Distance between the road that's been traveled and how far we have left to go with regard to three components: the learning of the official languages, the quality of services provided by federal institutions, and the organization of the Vancouver 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. Despite the significant investment that it represents for our country's future, access to official languages learning opportunities remains limited. By enabling young Canadians to acquire skills that will benefit them professionally, personally, and culturally, we are contributing to their professional mobility. In the current economic climate, I find it unfortunate that governments and post-secondary institutions are not focusing enough on second language learning programs. Although students are encouraged to take the bilingual path throughout their academic career, post-secondary institutions seldom provide them with opportunities to continue studying in their second language. After 40 years of language policy, it is high time that we remove the last roadblocks on this path. The federal government should bring together the various players in order to create a true second language learning continuum. Selon nos observations effectuées auprès des institutions,
according to our observations of institutions, government services are offered in the minority language when there is significant demand, 75% of the time. Very often, federal institutions do not actively offer their services in the language of the minority, and citizens hesitate to ask for these services in their language. Moreover, we are too quick to settle on providing the linguistic minority with a translated version of the services provided to the majority. However, in an important judgment rendered on February 5, 2009 in the Desrochers case, the Supreme Court declared that federal institutions must consider both the nature of services and the specific needs of official language communities. In other words, the obligation to provide services of equal quality in both official languages does not necessarily mean identical services. Finally, the organization of the Vancouver 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games clearly illustrates some obstacles to incorporating linguistic duality into our Canadian reality. I continue to be concerned that our country finds it difficult to meet the challenges related to official languages at the Games in an exemplary manner, especially considering its 26 million Anglophone and 9 million Francophone inhabitants.
December, and by the results of the awareness campaign subsequently conducted among federal institutions, the Organizing Committee and federal institutions must do more to ensure that the Canadian public and visitors have access to services in both of our country's official languages. I'm still hoping that the Games will reflect linguistic duality before, during, and after the athletes' arrival. There's little time left to solve the most pressing problems, namely those pertaining to translation, interpretation, and signage. Federal institutions that have a specific role to play must realize that the arrival of thousands of additional visitors will lead to an increased demand for bilingual services. This is especially important in terms of services provided at the Games venues and services provided to the traveling public, mainly in the Vancouver and Toronto airports. The Olympic Games is proof of the need to better integrate official languages into federal institutions, not only in terms of services, but also in terms of support for official language communities and the promotion of linguistic duality. En 2010,
In 2010, it will be 5 years since Parliament strengthened Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. I have to admit that I'm not very impressed with how the government has managed the implementation of the provisions in this part of the Act. The response has been slow and minimal. My staff and I will therefore be paying special attention to this issue in 2009-2010. To foster linguistic duality in Canadian society, I call upon new stakeholders to get involved. As I will explain in a forthcoming presentation, I encourage post-secondary institutions to forge close ties between the second language programs offered and the need for bilingual staff from employers, such as the Federal Public Service. I also encourage young people to continue improving their second language by taking advantage of opportunities offered by the other language community. Finally, I encourage public sector leaders and managers of public services to show leadership and commitment to make linguistic duality a value in federal institutions.
Facilitate the training of future leaders who are committed to promoting linguistic duality as a value, both through their day-to-day actions and through the implementation and management of language programs and policies. Naturally, all of this must be supported by sustained leadership on the part of the federal administration based on a dynamic vision of linguistic duality that's characterized by respect, dialogue, and partnership. For this to happen, the federal government's ongoing commitment is necessary. In June 2008, the government released its roadmap for Canada's linguistic duality. I'm still concerned about the delay in the implementation of this initiative, the lack of information on certain projects, and the uncertainty that stems from the elimination of programs in some areas targeted by the roadmap 2008-2013. The lack of specific objectives pertaining to the government roadmap does little to assure us that it will be implemented effectively. Community organizations, the education community, and provincial governments are concerned because they do not have a clear vision of the federal government's actions. While the investments allocated to various programs are certainly welcome, the government would do well to outline an overall vision and specific objectives that it intends to achieve. La vision des parlementaires.
The parliamentarians' vision in 1969 was bold, ambitious, and above all, crucial to the future of this country. 40 years later, other challenges lie ahead. At the time, this vision was a way to bring Canadians together and to ensure that the state could serve them in the official language of their choice. Now, it is a way to help them reach their full potential. Thank you for your attention, and I would now like to take the remaining time to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Commissioner. So we'll begin with Ms. Zarak. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Fraser, and thank you for joining us this morning. I read your report, and I really feel that you have concerns about the inaction of the government with respect to its commitments under the Official Languages Act. You appeared recently before this committee, and you shared your concerns with us with respect to the transfer of responsibilities under the Treasury Board. So the committee thought that it would be relevant to invite the President of the Treasury Board to come before us. And Mr. Toews appeared on the 5th of May, and he mentioned when he was speaking to us that there had been some restructuring, but that he hadn't changed his responsibilities at all. So he talked about Part 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the Official Languages Act. However, in your second recommendation, which deals with the President of the Treasury Board, you recommend that he fully assume his responsibilities under Part 8 of the Official Languages Act, which deals with federal institutions, including separate employers. Mr. Toews never spoke about his responsibilities under that part of the Act. Now, you did raise it in your second recommendation, so I assume it's very important. Do you feel that he is fully aware of his responsibilities under that part of the Act? And you can tell us actually what those responsibilities are under Part 8. Well, under Article 8, he has certain responsibilities. And since his appearance, I have discussed my recommendations with him. And I also spoke with the person responsible for human resources, who also appeared before this committee, Ms. Doré. And like yourself, we were somewhat concerned about how this new restructuring was being presented and the fact that it didn't mention official languages. Nonetheless, we were reassured that it was just a typo, actually. It was just a mistake in the actual presentation. However, I have to say that nonetheless, it didn't make me want to remove that recommendation. So, to the effect that he has to fully assume his responsibilities under that part of the Act. Because as I have previously said, before you as well, I believe, there are certain benefits to that transfer of responsibility to Treasury Board. There's a certain destabilization that occurs when a transfer takes place, but at the same time, it must be acknowledged that when your responsibilities are reinforced, there are certain benefits that result. Responses are given quickly when they come from an agency rather than when they come from a less important organization. So this issue of horizontality is one that we have gone into in more depth, but we did that in last year's annual report. But we do continue to pay close attention to the situation. Perhaps Ms. Tremblay could expand on Part 8. Under Part 8, the responsibilities of a Treasury Board are described. And Treasury Board has responsibility for coordinating the implementation of Parts 4, 5, and 6, not Part 7, because Part 7 is the responsibility of Heritage Canada. They coordinate the implementation of that with federal institutions. So that's why we referred to Part 8, because that includes all the responsibilities of Treasury Board. So were you reassured by Treasury Board's response, Commissioner? Do you feel more reassured now? And that is that they will be able to fully assume its responsibilities. Because as you said, there are benefits that result from that type of transfer. So were you reassured by the answer? Do you feel that they will be meeting their obligations? Well, I would hesitate in using the word reassured. I have to oversee the Act. That's my responsibility, so I have to be vigilant. And I'm pleased. I was pleased to see when they appeared before you and when I spoke to them. And in my discussions with Ms. Doré, that they said that the role of the official languages had not been diminished in their restructuring. However, when they first presented their changes, they neglected to mention Official Languages Act, and so I would say that indicates certain reflexes or indicates the fact that it's not necessarily the main priority. That they have to be reminded of that. So when I say that there's a certain amount of inconsistency in the federal government's approach to official languages, this is the sort of thing that I'm referring to. This is relevant, the fact that they forgot to mention it. Now we'll move on to Mr. Nadeau. Good morning to all of you, Mr. Fraser. Good morning to all of your colleagues. Mr. Fraser, I read your report. I have 12 points to raise. I know I can't do that in 5 minutes. And I'll take as little time as possible to speak myself in order to leave the floor to you. I have worked with the Federation of Acadian and Francophone Communities and with La Jeunesse Canadienne-Française. I've worked with school boards in Saskatchewan. I was a teacher also in a minority language community. And there's one aspect that never, ever, perhaps not never, but almost never actually appears, and that is the issue of assimilation. I think that we need an independent Quebec in Quebec because it's not true that Canada has done the work that it was supposed to do. It has left it up to the provinces. And you say in your conclusion that we're closer to the targets, but we're still very far. And sometimes you say that we're even further from the targets set, because it's the French it's the French fact, the French language that's losing ground.
Bilingualism in Canada is a concept, it's not a reality. And that's what hurts. So when we talk about assimilation, at one point in your report, you say that pressure on official languages communities to assimilate them is still significant. That's on page 9 of the report. You also give an example on page 55, where 84%, I'd rather say Acadians and Franco-Canadians rather than Francophones outside of Quebec, but 84% of them are bilingual. So they are actually being assimilated more than respect for the French fact. It's not a crime to be bilingual. I'm bilingual. We're talking about 84% of people. But I'd like to know why we don't include the fact of French speakers who are being assimilated. People who speak French from a very young age are being assimilated, and that should be in the report. And I would simply like to ask you to include it in the report in the future, 3 or 4 pages, to show that it is a problem, and it's a problem that persists. I don't think that we avoid the concept. We talk about vulnerability, about the challenges when it comes to the vitality of those communities. But I'd like to talk about what the historian at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Gratien Allaire, he said, and it inspired us. He has done a great deal of historical work, and he's very committed in his work. On page 63, he says that now we talk about health in terms of well-being and improving well-being. We do not talk about an absence of disease, but we talk less and less about a lack of vitality in communities as being a lack of assimilation. So when we look at activities and engagement in the community, I think that there is evidence that partly because of the success of the kind of work that you've done to manage schools, to create schools in Western Canada, now communities are stronger than they were in the past. Well, does assimilation exist? Yes. But when I see schools in school boards making efforts to try to reach out to hexagamous families to try to promote French schools to those who are entitled, when I see the efforts on the part of the Education Ministry in Ontario, I think that we can talk about vitality. Thank you very much, Mr. Nadeau. Let's continue with Mr. Godet. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to congratulate you, Mr. Fraser, and your team, and thank you for giving hope to my bill, C-232, to change the way that Supreme Court judges are appointed. I'd like to get your comments. And I know that you've said that it's a very strong message from above. It's leadership. For the entire country. It's a bilingual country, or supposedly bilingual country. We're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Official Languages Act this year. And I have a question. In your report, there are a number of places where you say that you're disappointed, things aren't going quick enough, it's not working. But the Minister of Heritage, James Moore, answered a question in the House of Commons saying that Canada is making a great deal of progress since the Official Languages Act was adopted in 1989. And he quoted the positive passage from your report stating that the future of minority language communities is highly promising. But it's contradictory. Throughout the report, you say that you're not happy, and then you say that it's promising. Last night, there was a vote on my bill for Supreme Court judges. Not one Conservative member voted for it, not even the minister in charge of the Francophonie. Not even the chair of the Official Languages Committee. Not one member of the Official Languages Committee. And it was a private member's bill. People could vote on it without toeing the party line. Don't you think that it's a message from the current government that it's not willing to accept two official languages and respect that by sending a message to the Supreme Court? There are 33 million people in this country, and we can't find 9 bilingual judges in this country? I want to be very clear. Commissioner, I couldn't care less whether there's an Anglophone or Francophone at the Supreme Court, but they have to be able to read our laws in both official languages of the country. You've said it yourself. The Act is written in French, and it's written in English. It's not translated. And the courts are there for Canadians. They're not there to appoint judges and reward people. We're talking about 33 million Canadians and Quebecers. Don't tell me that we can't find 9 people in the legal system who can't speak both languages. If that's the case, we have a problem. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. Mr. Chair, I'd like to congratulate the member on his bill and for very eloquently defending principles that I myself defend, namely that Supreme Court judges should be able to understand pleas, documents, and Canadian law. As the member has said, acts are not translated. They're drafted in English and in French. The day before yesterday at my press conference, I answered a question on that topic. And I said, and as an aside, I will answer the member's question regarding different interpretations of my report. The language situation in Canada is complex. There are success stories, and there are stories of failure. It's the very nature of the political debate that some will highlight success stories and others will rather tend to point to failures, challenges, and problems. I take all stories into account in my report. And what I try to do when I present a report is to show what challenges lie ahead. So I think that when we see those elements, I think that I can say that there's inconsistency. And when I say inconsistency, we have a system where Canadians are entitled to being heard. That system has been improved to ensure that the accused, can have a trial in the language of his or her choice. But there is a major exception, and that exception is the Supreme Court, and I find that inconsistent. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Now we'll give the floor to Ms. Glover. I'd like to welcome the witnesses, and I have to say that when I read the report, I was very pleased to see that you concentrated on success stories. I am very interested in success stories because we know that a success doesn't come before hard work, except in the dictionary. So we will continue working, and we hope that there will be more success. But I would like to point out that we met this week here in the committee, and I'd like to mention what Ms. Zarak said. The members of our committee are not necessarily always up to speed on what happens in the area of official languages. I patiently listened as the Ombudsman, who was our witness, was questioned. And I heard questions that were repeated again and again regarding promotions in national defense. And our own members did not know that a letter had been sent on January 5th, 2009 by a general stating that in order to get a promotion, officers had to be bilingual. So, now I've heard that Mr. Toews did not follow through properly in his department. I have to say that we do not always know everything, and I'd like to repeat on behalf of Mr. Toews. As Mr. Tremblay said, Part 8 is the whole that refers to 456. So, it's not that Mr. Toews didn't know. It's because Part 8 does not exist without a 456. So I wanted to mention that. But let's come back to the success stories. I would like to quote from your report. In the last year, Heritage Canada set up a number of initiatives to strengthen its coordination role between departments under Part 7. As we know, there are no training sessions for members of the Privy Council and the Treasury Board Secretariat in order to raise their awareness with regard to Part 7 and how to take Part 7 into account when reviewing submissions and memorandums to Cabinet. There have been success stories, and Mr. Toews is aware of those success stories within his department, and that's how Part 7 has an impact on his department. There is work underway to assist those who present memorandums to Cabinet to be able to present policies and programs on official languages, language communities, and linguistic duality. I would like to know, if you were Minister of Heritage and Language and Official Languages, what would you do differently if you were the Minister of Official Languages? That's an interesting and difficult question. I have to admit that I do not aspire to the position of minister, so I hesitate to say anything definite. But I would like to talk about the government's role in general. And I would say that in any government. What I find very interesting about Part 7 and the amendment to Part 7 in 2005 is that it opens the door to cooperation among federal institutions and communities. I agree completely that Canadian Heritage has done things to inform other departments, to call meetings and hold information sessions. But the true success stories linked to Part 7 have occurred when people in the regions have taken the initiative to establish direct cooperation links to set up interesting projects with communities. That's what's interesting about Part 7. It's this openness to cooperation. Thank you, Ms. Glover. So you said meetings and cooperation. We'll get back to that. I was going to say thank you, Minister, but I'll say thank you, Commissioner. Let's start our second round with Mr. Demwell. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, and people from your office. I have the flu this morning, so I may not be in top form, but I'll do my best. Commissioner, if we look at the facts, I'd like to come back to what Ms. Glover said earlier. But the Treasury Board told you that it was a typo. Well, it's a pretty big typo, because I'm sure that you heard what he said at committee, but he wasn't able to differentiate between sections or parts 4, 5, and 6 of the Act. So, unless we let Ms. Glover speak for him, we'll invite him back to the committee and ask him what he knows and doesn't know about what goes on in his department, particularly with regard to official languages. I want to know whether he will guarantee that people in his department observe their obligations. In your speech, you say that in 2010, 5 years will have gone by, and that's with regard to the amendment to Part 7. And I would like to know whether you think that it's acceptable for official language communities and official language communities. They presented an application for funds, and I'm going to give you an example of many other cases like that. They requested for operating funds and projects. That was in November 2008. The agreements came to an end in March 2009, and we are now, I think, the 27th of May, or 28th of May. That's even worse. Now we're at the 28th of May, and those organizations have been forgotten. They're wondering whether they will obtain their funds. They don't know whether they have to close up shop because the funding is not available. They're wondering when they will be able to accept different projects so that communities can move forward with projects in education. I'm talking about education here. They want to know whether the projects will go ahead in colleges and universities. Do you find that it's acceptable for those communities to go into their own pockets and use volunteers to administer their projects, and for them to be in a situation where they do not even know whether they will be able to implement projects that will promote official languages in minority communities, be it in French or in English, in the area of education? Mr. Chair, I won't go into detail with regard to that project. I've just learned about the difficulties today, but I will say that if there is a problem throughout the country and it is a major problem for all organizations that deal with the government. It is funding delays. I have been told from the Maritimes to BC about problems experienced by groups that apply for funding and end up getting their check in October or December. And we're talking about money that has to be spent before March 31st. And this creates two difficulties. There's a euphemism for it within the government, and it's called a risk management. Well, risk management, when you don't know whether you're going to get a check, creates a great deal of stress for people who work with very limited means already. But there's also a problem that was raised by more than one group. And that is that often those organizations work in small communities. And they want to use their funding to encourage people who work right there in the community. When you have a study or recurrent funding where the check is on its way, but work has to be done in 2 or 3 months, they can't turn to a group in their region. They have to go to a consultant group in Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver that has the resources to do the work quickly by the end of December, to be able to do the work by the 31st of March. So it's a double challenge.
So, Commissioner, let's take an example involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. 7 months later, there's no money and no answer. You don't necessarily need the check, but you need at least a response. We'll continue with Ms. Gay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fraser, it gives me great pleasure to see you again here today. I won't ask you what you would do if you were minister, if you would do anything better. I'm sure you would do many things better. I have a newspaper article in front of me here, and I'll read from it for you. This came out yesterday. It says that there are unilingual customs officers who will not have to learn French. They will continue to greet visitors to the international airport in Ottawa. And they will offer bilingual services if requested by travelers. Mr. Fraser, that is unacceptable, especially in Ottawa. Especially in Ottawa. We know perfectly well that we're supposed to be bilingual here, but it's false. All you have to do is go on Spark Street and you can't get served in French. And I think that's unacceptable. And that's something that we have to look at more closely. There was another article about bilingualism in airports and that there's a poor performance in airports. The Olympic Games are coming to Vancouver. We know that there is a problem. We know that we won't be able to provide services in both languages, but there are 9 million Francophones and 26 million Anglophones, and we should be able to provide those services in both languages. But it's not going to happen. There's going to be a big surprise at the Olympic Games in 2010. And it's not going to be very flattering for Canada, not at all. So I'd like to hear you on that. And the fact that customs officers are not obliged to learn French. That's absolutely unacceptable. I think actually that's grounds for a complaint. We need to do something to change that. Mr. Chairman, we have had conversations with the Border Services Agency, and we want this service to be improved. However, I would point this out. Under the Act, the linguistic obligations to serve citizens is not an individual obligation, it's an institutional obligation. And so what is important here is that the Border Services Agency be capable of providing citizen services in the language of their choice. Now, to respond to the member's question with respect to airports and the Olympics, that is exactly what I did by raising these challenges. I did that horizontal study. And with respect to the Olympics, we started with a study that we made public last December, followed by an awareness campaign with about 20 federal departments and federal institutions, precisely to tell these institutions that this is a global event. And one of the responses I received was of some concern to me, because they said, well, it's business as usual. But I'm sorry, it's not business as usual. This is a worldwide event. Everyone will be watching us. There are high expectations of Canada at this event. I'm sorry, I don't have much time, but all those who came before us with respect to the Games expressed their concerns regarding bilingualism. Not one of those witnesses said everything is fine and all is well, even with respect to broadcasting and services on the ground. Whether it has to do with directing people or welcoming people, there won't only be athletes there. I'm not too concerned about athletes, actually. I think the athletes will have the services they require. However, with respect to visitors coming to the Games, I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned about signage. And it's not true that everything will be ready for 2010. People are telling us that. They've come before this committee to tell us that. So I'd like to know what you can do to encourage people to move a little faster on this. Well, I've had conversations, and I continue to have conversations with the organizers, with the government, and I continue to point out how important this event is. As I was saying earlier, we undertook an awareness campaign for these institutions. We're using this annual report to, again, raise existing problems in airports, for example, and we will be doing a follow-up with this report as well, the report that that came out in December, a more focused follow-up. And one point that I made to my own organization and to the organizers was that we're not going to wait for the publication of a report in September to say, here's our analysis and here are your problems. As soon as we raise problems, persistent problems, then we will be communicating those observations to the organizers. So we continue to pay close attention to the preparedness. But I don't want to come as an afterthought and tell them that what they did wrong. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Ms. Gay. We'll now turn to Mr. Lemieux. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for coming today. Mr. Godin raised the issue of judges on the Supreme Court. So I would also like to make a few comments about that. It's quite obvious to me that bilingualism is very important to me. And the government appoints judges to the Supreme Court, and it's a criteria that is so important that 8 out of 9 judges on the Supreme Court are actually bilingual. So that is a great accomplishment, not only on the part of our government, but also on the part of previous governments.
Of course, when it comes to bilingual, or when it comes to Supreme Court judges, for example, it's important to have judges from across the country to represent the different regions. I don't think any Canadian would be comfortable with having all Supreme Court judges come from only one region of Canada. But it's not mandated in law. For example, it's also important to have men and women as Supreme Court judges, but it's not mandated in law. It's important to have bilingual judges as well, but it's not mandated in law. And if the government starts mandating everything, percentage of women, exactly which regions Supreme Court judges must come from, exactly all these different criteria, you can imagine this would make quite a difficult situation. Mais la plus grande inquiétude pour moi,
my greatest concern is this. If Mr. Godin's bill is passed, then there won't necessarily be a promotion of both official languages, because a critical point under the Official Languages Act is that Canadians have the right to be unilingual francophone or unilingual anglophone. It's up to them. or to be bilingual. So those are the options for every Canadian. So if there is a well-qualified Canadian with considerable legal expertise and very competent, then there is a best candidate. However, they happen to be unilingual francophone, then, according to Mr. Godin, that is not acceptable.
A unilingual Anglophone judge who is truly the best qualified candidate, he has the best legal experience. This law would say you need not apply, you are not acceptable to Monsieur Godin if this law passes. That's my concern, and I'd like to know, Commissioner, you're the Commissioner of Official Languages, I'd like to know what you would say to unilingual francophone judge candidates, les personnes unilingues francophones.
Unilingual francophone candidates.
Judge candidates, that they are no longer acceptable to the government if Mr. Godin, if his law applies.
Mr. Chairman, I have already spoken to judges and former judges of the Supreme Court who, in their interviews of clerks for the Supreme Court, have made it clear that they feel they cannot be sufficiently supported by clerks who are not able to read the documentation in both official languages. And that's meant that some universities, some law schools, in Quebec, their students are no longer being interviewed because judges have come to the conclusions that the students are not graduating from that law school with sufficient mastery of both official languages. So I guess my response to you and to this committee would be that I think the ability to read the jurisprudence that comes up from lower courts in both languages is a critical quality for any judge of the Supreme Court. And any person who had ambitions to be on the Supreme Court would, I think, from an early age, decide that they would have to have some familiarity with the jurisprudence in both official languages.
I'm not sure all judges from an early age have the desire to be a Supreme Court judge. It's something that develops throughout their career. And if I look, for example, in British Columbia, the pourcentage des francophones,
the percentage of francophones is 1.4%. And so if you need to find a bilingual judge practicing law in the French language, means there are only a few candidates. But however, we want the choice to be broad. We want there to be several candidates with considerable experience.
Why? Because I don't believe it shows respect for les unilingues francophones.
For unilingual francophones and unilingual anglophones here in Canada. Mr. Godin, you now have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I mean, the bill has passed last night, but just for the record, the last time when they evaluated or they looked at it for judge for the Supreme Court, there were, from the information I got, was 4 candidates very and totally capable of doing the job, and they were bilingual, the 4 of them. And they had the choice of 4 of them. The next appointment will be in 5 years from now. 5 years from now. The University of Toronto, the representative of the University of Toronto was here a week ago or 2 weeks ago, said it will be the good signal to send to the university that we could start to train our people. The only reason they're not getting the training is because they don't need to do it. At the minute they get the message they need to do it, they will be happy to do it. Then I don't think this is a problem, what Mr. Lemieux is bringing out. I think it's a principle about, is the court made for the judge and the appointment, or the court is made for the citizen? Is it for the justice of the citizen, or is it for having a judge to be appointed? And when you're up to that point, when you already have judge that is at the smaller court, or it could be at the provincial court, or is at the federal court, you're not going to tell me that at that point is not start to be qualified to be a Supreme judge, because we have many judges in our country, and I trust more our system on that. Then, ma question, c'est pour Air Canada.
My question is about Air Canada. Is Air Canada breaching the Official Languages Act? Because when you get to the airport in Ottawa, you pointed out in your report, and I think you were very clear on this, are you unhappy with them, or is there a breach of the Act? Many questions have been raised by reporters. For example, why aren't other airline companies subject to the Act? But what must be recalled is that Air Canada used to belong to the government. It was a public company. When were they bought? Well, they were bought along with the Official Languages Act. So I'd like to hear what you have to say on that. It's still a problem. It's a persistent problem, and it didn't just begin last year. Mr. Chairman, we have already intervened in the courts with respect to Air Canada. Air Canada challenged, actually, its linguistic obligations with respect to service. And the court ruled, actually after an appeal by Air Canada, ruled that Air Canada did have obligations in terms of its results. So it wasn't sufficient for Air Canada to simply state that they had made an effort and that they were providing courses, for example. That actually, with respect to a language, Air Canada had obligations, and it had an obligation in terms of the results achieved. So if there are no results in linguistic terms, in terms of service, then it is very clear to me, well, that Air Canada is not complying with the law. Then, Mr. Fraser, if they aren't, and if the court said that there had to be results, then what happens next? You see, if I contravene the law, I get a ticket. So what happens? The government says it's very proactive and it's working with official languages. Should there be some sort of penalty? What happens? What's the solution? Because we're not just talking about goodwill. Goodwill isn't working here. I'm just saying that just pure willpower doesn't work. So, well, one of our recommendations was this. The government should come back to the House with a new bill that would cover the whole of the Air Canada family. Because one of our observations was this. There were 3 attempts on the part of the federal government with respect to new legislation on Air Canada. And each time there was a sort of reorganization, a restructuring, and all of a sudden, one part of the family was no longer subject to the Act. That was the result. So one of my recommendations this year, and I discussed this with the minister, who is actually willing to consider this, was that there be a new legislation that covers all of Air Canada. Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Ms. Mendez. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Fraser, and good morning to your colleagues. I'd like to refer to something you said in your opening remarks. You said that there should be new players that should be invited in terms of developing official languages policy. I believe that all provincial jurisdictions have to be respected. That's clear to me. But do you not think that it is now time that we attempt to negotiate with the ministers of education? Because I think that would be the best way of providing a pool of people, of citizens who are trained in both languages. I think I could be a good example of that. I was raised with 3 languages. I read them, I understand them, I write them. And I think it's the best way to provide the federal public service with individuals who will be able to fulfill all those functions in both official languages. So I'm not sure how that would work legally. Perhaps Ms. Giguère could enlighten us. But I'm wondering how we could eventually deal with provincial governments. I think it is time now that they be part of these types of negotiations in order to be able to develop official languages in Canada. Could you give us your perspective on that? Mr. Chairman, when we raise the importance of calling forth new players, it was intentional, but we were intentionally vague on that and on how to identify those new players. My observation is that at the provincial level, at the level of universities,
for certain municipal or education institutions, there is an interest. So there are promising signs insofar as at the last meeting in Quebec City last year, the provincial ministers in charge of the Francophonie and French language affairs passed a motion saying that they wanted increased cooperation with the federal government. So the door is open. There is already a great deal of funding from the federal government to the provinces for second language education and for language education in minority communities. Every time that I've raised the issue of transparency and accountability linked to those funds, I've been told that the Federation doesn't work that way. We do not require provinces to identify exactly how they spend federal funds. I've been told that it's difficult to monitor and to make those kinds of demands. But I think there's a certain openness. I know that the Council of Education Ministers of Canada has an ongoing discussion about the possibility of having a common French language test that would tell students what level of French they speak, and it would be a voluntary test. Students would not only be compared to students in their class, but those students and those students' parents would be able to see what level they are at on a national and international level. So I think those are promising signs, but it requires a certain amount of willingness to cooperate. And in the time that I have left, I'd like to talk about the Olympic Games. There is very little time remaining before the date in 2010 for the Games. What do you think the most urgent recommendations that you've made are with regard to bilingualism at the Olympic Games? To me, it's an urgent matter. 30 seconds. We've identified a number of problems with regard to translation. There are many, many documents that still need to be translated. There are athlete profiles for the athletes arriving in December. And there have been talks between VANOC and the Translation Bureau, and I've been told that VANOC hasn't made any specific requests from the Translation Bureau, or to the Translation Bureau. So I know that there are outstanding translation problems, interpretation problems, signage as well. Also with regard to recruiting volunteers. And we continue to highlight how important it is to have French language content in cultural events. Thank you very much. You are talking about the opening and closing ceremonies for the Games. Let's continue with Mr. Petit. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Fraser. I'd like to make a comment. I'm from Quebec. The Official Languages Act has been in effect for 40 years. It was created by the Liberals in '68. And since then, we've had Bill 101. The Separatist Party has been created, and that party is really mad at the rest of the parties in the countries because it's not protecting, the other parties aren't protecting our language in other provinces. In Montreal, the city has gone from being a national urban center to being a regional urban center. We have a great deal of immigration from French-speaking countries, but it's lower than other countries. Also, we have the regulations regarding French in the workplace, but it depends, because it depends whether the people who speak French are French speakers from birth or not. So I don't want to be difficult, but I want to understand something. You said something that caught my attention. In your opening statement, you said that assimilation is certain. And perhaps you can look at your notes, but you answered a question. If assimilation is definite, well, shouldn't Quebec separate from Canada then, as Mr. Nadeau was suggesting? But this is serious. I'm from Quebec. I want to stay within Canada, but they've been saying for 40 years that we do not belong in Canada because elsewhere in Canada, people don't speak French. So this is serious. So there are two choices. Either you keep covering up the issue or you bring it out into the open. Because as official languages commissioner, what would you do? They've been going on and on about this for 40 years, so what do we do? I would have to look at the transcriptions, but I don't think that I said that assimilation is definitive in the sense that it's inevitable. I may have said that it's true that assimilation exists as a phenomenon. You can't contradict figures. But if you look at the 40-year history, and if you look at where we were with regard to vitality of communities, of minority communities 40 years ago, I think that now we're in a better place than we were back then. Now there are French language schools throughout the country. You can get access to French language television and radio throughout the country, 3 times out of 4 throughout the country in designated Francophone positions. French speakers can obtain services. It's not perfect. It's not as good as I would like. 75% is not a scholarship winning grade for any student, and we're getting 75% as a grade, but we're not talking about a failure either. If you look at how far we've come, and if you remember that in the 60s, there was a tendency in Quebec to treat minority communities outside of Quebec like dead ducks, as René Lévesque used to say. But I can tell you that as I went from one end of the country, I was struck by the vitality, the energy, and imagination of minority communities outside of Quebec. I also have to say that choosing to live in a minority situation means choosing a situation that is complicated and sometimes difficult, whether you're an Anglophone in Quebec or a Francophone in a province other than Quebec. We are living in a changing world. There are language pressures throughout the world. But I do not believe that minority communities are destined to disappear. Thank you, Mr. Patsy. Thank you, Commissioner. And we will end our third round with Mr. Nadeau. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fraser. I'd like to highlight something. Mr. Lemieux was saying something earlier, and I do not agree with him. If there's only one unilingual Anglophone on the at the Supreme Court, that's one Anglophone too many. Everyone should be bilingual at the Supreme Court. Bilingualism is not just for the judges who sit on the Supreme Court, it's for the citizens who must go there to receive justice. On page 81, under the previous government, this committee tabled a report on recourse with regard to funding mechanisms. Under the Liberals and under the Conservatives, I know because I experienced it, small organizations, because they don't have many members but they do wonderful things, are asked to submit everything by strict deadlines because otherwise they're penalized. But then the federal government sends the money 7 months later. I'm telling you, it's unacceptable, and it's still the case. The report I mentioned is well known. You cited it in your report, and I find that very difficult for those communities. I'd like to talk to you about the CCN. It has an impact on my riding, and I want to say that I congratulate Marie Lemay and the members of the CCN. But I have to say, Mr. Fraser, that there's one person I want you to note this. Russell Mills is the president of the board of directors. He was supposed to be bilingual, and he's not. And that is an insult to the French fact in my region, in Gatineau, and for Franco-Ontarians. The CCN should, through Lawrence, the NCC rather, under Lawrence Cannon. I'm not sure whether Minister Cannon appointed him or not, but I'm saying that it's unacceptable because the NCC has too much power over municipalities in the region. So if you have a board of directors where there are members from all over the country that tell people what to do in Gatineau and in Ottawa because they have clout, well, in my humble opinion, it should be highlighted that Russell Mills is not bilingual. You mentioned the issue, and it has an impact on Ottawa and elsewhere. And I'm mentioning this so that you can comment on it, but I'm talking about the Tulip Festival in Canada. We are told that they are not obligated to provide services in French, but they're a third party linked to the National Capital Commission. So we must absolutely tell those organizations that if the Tulip Festival thought that it wasn't under an obligation to provide services in French, well, they're wrong. Finally, I'd like to talk about the airports in Vancouver and Toronto and the Vancouver Games. Ms. Commissioner, we're talking about an international level event. Imagine we are welcoming francophones from throughout the world, and people in Canada will be going to Vancouver to see the games. There will be a huge volume of people who will need services in French. And the fact that there will be services lacking is completely unacceptable. There is 1 minute left. Mr. Fraser, you have the floor. I would like to thank the member for his question. I'd like to give a two-part answer. He highlighted a number of elements linked to the national capital. We highlighted the NCC's exemplary behavior with regard to services to the greater public. There's the National Arts Centre, where there is an active offer of services. People are welcomed in French, and it's a reflex for those organizations, whether it be to purchase a ticket at the National Arts Center, when the ushers bring you to your seat, really it's someone who welcomes you in both official languages. And I hope that that spirit will become part of the national capital's culture, and it's not the case right now. I think that when it comes to cultural and social events, it is extremely important to integrate both official languages into the national capital's culture. You made a distinction between the Olympic Games and the normal situation. And I know that efforts are being made by federal institutions to meet the higher expectations created by the Games, and that during the post-Olympic period, standards will be even higher. I don't think it will be a situation where once the Games are over, we'll say, phew, that's done, we'll be able to go back to business as usual. We will adjourn for a few minutes, or suspend for a couple of minutes. Mr. Godin, on a point of order. I have more questions on this subject. I'd like to ask a supplementary question. You can ask the question now or after the break, and Mr. Fraser will be able to answer. But we have up until 10:30. We're going to go from 10:30 to 11, according to the agenda. I'd like to be fair to all members, so we can do another complete round if you like. But the thing is we need time to listen to the report on second language learning in post-secondary educations. I drew up the agenda, and I know that we had from 9 to 10:30 to talk about this issue. Well, Mr. Godin can go ahead, but I want to make sure that we have enough time to ask questions following Mr. Fraser's presentation. So, if I understand correctly, Mr. Godin, you have a question, or do you want to start another round of questions? Mr. Chair, just a moment, Madam Glover. But we want to give Mr. Fraser 10 minutes for his presentation, so perhaps we can have 2-minute turns. Or 3-minute turns? 3-minute questions? All right, so let's start. We'll go in order. We have the Conservative Party first. Mr. Chong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will ask my questions in English.
Your annual report, and in it you note that it's not certain whether the target to double the number of bilingual Canadians between the ages of 15 to 19 is still in place. But I'm surprised it didn't form part of your recommendations. In other words, that it's not in your recommendations to call on the government to have that target in place. So are you not in pursuit of that objective as Commissioner, or is this something that you think isn't as important as some of the other recommendations that you've put in place?
No, I think it's a very important goal. I would say that that was subsumed in my general comment that I thought it was regrettable that clear objectives were not established for the roadmap generally, and that was one of the objectives and the pre-existing objectives in the action plan. The problem with one of the problems with that objective that was established in 2003 is that secondary education is a provincial jurisdiction. So it is hard to hold the federal government to account over something that's a direct provincial responsibility. That having been said, another recommendation was that and one of the things that I mentioned in my statement was the importance of the federal government in bringing together new players to the table to discuss the issues involved in the roadmap, and that is certainly one of them. And as I mentioned in response to an earlier question, I think that is clearly in the report. the door is open to that kind of collaboration from the ministers responsible for Francophone affairs who passed a motion to that effect at their meeting in Quebec City.
Okay. Well, we use the federal spending power to cajole provinces into meeting federal targets, as we did with the Canada Pension Plan and the Canada Health Act and many other programs of national importance. But
to make that point, I get lectures about the current nature of federalism. So I would encourage you from your side to, or I would encourage the member to continue making that argument.
Just a broader point, though. I think it's obviously a very detailed and well-researched annual report, but so often we focus on the symptoms of many of the challenges facing the French language in Canada, and we don't focus on one of the fundamental issues, which is that there is a decline in the use of French outside the province of Quebec. And I think this is a huge long-term issue for the country. Statistics Canada has noted that the number of bilingual Canadians between the ages of 15 and 19, the key demographic group, declined between 1996 and 2006 from 16 to 13%.
1 minute left, Mr. Chong.
Declined from 16 to 13%, and if that trend holds, that is the most worrisome trend of all, more worrisome than any other issues around the use of French in the public service, the use of French in our judicial system and the like, because that is where the rubber hits the road in the next 50 years. So, I would suggest that in future reports, maybe a heavier emphasis could be placed on examining the role of federal institutions and the federal government in promoting bilingualism amongst our young people, especially in not only our post-secondary education, as I know you're presently focused on, but in our public school system.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chong. Mr. Fraser, I'm going to have to ask you to answer this question at the next round. Madame Zarak.
We can go into it in more detail in terms of the next session.
Ms. Zarak. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was a letter that accompanied your report, and in that you expressed your concern given the current economic crisis. You said that in fact, because of the crisis, there might be some lack of funding with respect to current programs, and I've heard that concern again. Actually, I saw that in your first recommendation. So would you have any recommendation to make? I think it's very important. It's actually your first recommendation. You state that in order to stay the course, we have to put our commitments into action. We have to make them a reality. So what do you think we need to do to ensure that adequate funding will continue? Well, I think you need to remain vigilant. You are aware that there's already been an impact. And I'll tell you what was behind this recommendation. We're still experiencing the effects of the cuts in 1995, for example. The Collège Royal de Saint-Jean. And the government had started actually rebuilding that college, that military college. So that institution was abolished as a military training college about 15 years ago. And so I'm concerned. And I think we have to remain vigilant. When we are going through a crisis and when there is little investment and when there is a reallocation happening, then you have to be vigilant. Do I have time for another question? Yes. You conclude in your report And you say that we have to show Canada that French and English continue to have equal status in Canada. Do you think they still do have, and that they do currently have equal status in Canada? Well, I think there are considerable deficiencies. I think that there's a lack, actually. There are gaps in that equality of status, and we raise that in our report. But there are also many, many success stories that we raise. It's a complex situation. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Godin, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3, in your opening remarks, you say that in 2010 it will be 5 years since Parliament strengthened Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. Part 7 deals with promotion of of our 2 official languages. And organizations, as you know, as was raised by our colleagues, are not receiving their funding. Is that not a breach of Part 7? It deals with promotion, but the tools aren't being provided to do that work. So the government makes a commitment to help these communities, makes a commitment to provide funding. However, organizations then have to use credit and credit cards in order to survive, and they have to lay off people. So, Commissioner, how do you think these organizations can do promotion within their own communities? Mr. Chong talked about education and people. Yes, but this was all together. This was all a package. Mr. Chairman, I already said that this is a serious situation because the organizations are in a very vulnerable position at this point. Now, I would hesitate in saying that one action or another is a breach of Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. Because we analyze each and every complaint dealing with Part 7. It's a serious assessment of the situation. Yes, but Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, the Commissioner of Official Language is a watchdog. That's his mandate. So you are an officer of Parliament and you report to Parliament. You don't report to the Government of Canada, you report to Parliament. That is your mandate. So I raised the issue of communities not getting their funding. I mean, it's happened not just under the Conservative government, it's happened under the Liberal government. It's been happening ever since I've actually been here. So when will this analysis be over, and when will there actually be any consequences? Well, I don't think we've actually received a specific complaint with respect to that problem, have we? Yes, but who makes the complaint? Can I make the complaint? Does it come from the organization? From me? Absolutely. Well, then you'll be getting my complaint. Thank you, Mr. Nadeau. Mr. Fraser, you looked at 15 institutions. 9 out of those federal institutions saw their performance actually decline, worsen. 25% of Francophones cannot receive service in their language. 90% of the complaints come from Francophones. I'm talking about complaints to the Commissioner of Official Languages. And I know we're not just talking about the public service, but it's especially the federal public service. I'm not blaming the civil servants. We're talking about the institution. So why is it that this situation persists? And who should we be talking to so that something changes? Well, I continue to identify those problems, the ones that you pointed out. And here's my interpretation of the situation. there is a lack of reflexes within these institutions when it comes to bilingual greetings and active offers. And I would answer you like this. I have concluded that there's a limit to that the complaint process has its limitations. There's a limit to how reactive actions can change the situation. So letters have been written to institutions with respect to complaints, and it seems like the same cases and the same excuses are recurring. The services weren't provided in both languages, and that is why we thought we should be more proactive and not just wait for these complaints to arrive before we act. We thought we should move ahead of this complaint process, because complaints aren't only the indicators of problems. Sometimes people are just resigned. They don't bother putting in complaints because they feel the process is useless. So we're trying to be more proactive with these institutions in order to change that type of behavior. Thank you, Commissioner. We'll take a break for 1 minute to give you time, and you and your colleagues.
Alors, on va continuer tout de suite avec...
We'll continue now with the second part of our meeting. We'll be hearing Mr. Fraser again, and this time it will be on the federal government's support for post-secondary institutions and their efforts in promoting bilingualism in Canada. Mr. Fraser, you'll be giving us the results of your work this morning. So with no further delay, I'll ask you to move on to your second presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to have this occasion to present the preliminary results of our study on second language learning opportunities in Canada's universities. This issue has long held great interest for me, and I believe that it is an important question for Canadians. I'm accompanied today by Karsten Quell, Director, Policy and Research, Mylène Thériault, Team Leader, Policy and Research, and Mark Goldenberg, the consultant who is working closely with members of my office on this study.
About second language learning at the elementary and secondary levels, I believe that this additional piece is essential in order for Canadians to have a complete continuum in second language learning. In fact, one of the recommendations included in my annual report is that the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages quickly implement the commitments announced in the Roadmap for Canada's Linguistic Duality to support second language learning by bringing together all partners involved in this issue. Knowledge of our two official languages is important for our young people's development, especially considering increased international competition and the global knowledge economy. Knowledge of both English and French by more Canadians is also important as part of Canada's commitment to linguistic duality and for the effective functioning of our country in many different sectors. And in the context of the renewal of the public service, it's important for a national government to have access to a larger pool of bilingual recruits.
Today I have provided you with the preliminary findings of this major study that we are undertaking. As part of our study, an extensive survey was conducted of second language programs and courses currently offered at Canada's universities. Access to second language courses at universities is generally good. However, opportunities for students to study in their second language are quite limited. We found that there is generally good access to regular programs and courses for students to learn their second language, but that there are relatively few opportunities to do so more intensively, such as taking academic subjects taught in the second language. Only a very limited number of courses in a very narrow range of subjects are being offered in the second language.
Second language policies or requirements. Those that exist are rather minimal and usually only apply to a few courses in a language other than French in Quebec and other than English throughout the rest of Canada. There is little formal collaboration between English and French language institutions in Canada that would give students greater second language exposure. While many Canadian students offer or facilitate exchange opportunities with other countries, exchange opportunities between institutions within Canada are quite limited. One finding that might interest you is that only a handful of public administration programs in Canada offer courses in the other language, have language requirements, or offer exchange-type activities. Qu'est-ce qui marche?
What works? How can we improve second language learning in university? Students said that the professor is the most important factor and that smaller classes provide for greater interaction in the second language. They find that content-rich second language courses, including more cultural and targeted subject matter content, makes the experience more stimulating. They believe that they would benefit from taking at least some subject matter courses in the second language to deepen their learning of it. Language learning experts agree on the effectiveness of content-based learning and that a range of learning supports has to be available and tailored to the particular situations and needs of institutions and students. They told us that recognition and accreditation are important motivators for students and that language learning opportunities should be provided early at the university level.
Administrators involved in second language programs say that leadership and commitment from the top are critical, that the university has to signal that it values second language learning. This requires planning, coordinating, organizing, and negotiating with other faculties and institutions. It also means additional costs to universities and faculties, costs that are not adequately recognized by the usual per capita funding formula. And students, professors, administrators, experts, and government officials all agree real-life opportunities to use and practice the second language, exchanges, and other opportunities for interaction with people who speak the other language are vital. You cannot fully learn another language simply by taking a course. Finally, we know of some interesting initiatives and good practices out there as well as possible models and approaches that are effective and that can point the way. These include the expertise and experience of bilingual institutions like the University of Ottawa and York's Glendon College, the efforts by Campus Saint-Jean and the Collège Universitaire Saint-Boniface to attract English language students and offer an immersion-type learning experience, initiatives to offer second language courses tailored to specific disciplines, such as Business English at the Université de Montréal and French for Business or Law at the University of Western Ontario, Simon Fraser University's Office of Francophone and Francophile Affairs, Memorial University's one-semester immersion program in Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, and others. So where do we go from here? Nous savons qu'un plus grand nombre.
We know that more and better second language learning opportunities at university are important for young people and for Canada. We know that opportunities for intensive exposure to the second language are limited. We know that there is a growing need and demand. And we know what works to make students more proficient. Our study points to a number of potential broad directions for intervention. We need to offer more intensive second language learning opportunities. We need to make better use of the potential of institutions that teach in the other official language through collaboration and partnerships and the use of technology. We need to offer students more exchanges and real-life opportunities to use their second language in Canada. And finally, we need to look again at second language policies and requirements and how they can be used to improve second language learning at university.
Recommendations will be available in the fall. Moving forward in these and other areas will require the commitment and collaboration of all interested parties, universities, educational organizations, government, and others. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, and I would also like to thank you for making available your preliminary report, as we are ourselves into our own report on the same topic. We'll be reviewing it next week, so we'll be able to include your analysis and great work in our own report. So we want to thank you on that, and also thank you for raising this issue in your report you just made earlier. So without any delay, we'll start on with a 4-minute round so we can be on time with Mr. Jean-Claude Damour.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Encore une fois, merci, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner. I'd like to read something by a university administrator and professor. He says that the key word is leadership and commitment by higher-ups. Those two things are essential. Within a university or post-secondary education institution, that applies. But I also think that if the federal government were able to set the standard and be a leader, I think that really it's also up to the federal government, not just to universities. I think that if the federal government set the tone with programs for the public service, for example, there would automatically be a movement within universities. You've said that it might cost more. Yes, that's possible. But there could also be a business opportunity for those universities. When an obligation exists, or when there is a true leadership on the part of the federal government saying that bilingualism is necessary, universities will follow. There are already universities and post-secondary education institutions that have started to go in that direction. Some are providing second language training to achieve bilingualism. So if they've already realized that this is an opportunity, well, they will cotton on to the fact that they can do even better business by drawing more or attracting more students. It's all good and well to say that the leaders of universities and colleges have an important effect. But don't you think that if leadership within the federal government in this area were improved, it would solve a great deal of the problem when it comes to leadership in universities and colleges. It would be a little encouragement to help universities be more proactive on this matter. Yes, the federal government plays a very important role, that's obvious, and I think that its role will become more and more important. The public service is renewing itself. There are almost 20,000 positions that become vacant within the public service every year. Looking forward, I know that the clerk, Kevin Lynch, has said this loud and clear. He met with the presidents of universities and he made it very clear. But I must say that I agree wholeheartedly that the federal government should send more messages to university presidents, to universities, to students, and to parents of students that linguistic duality is an important value for Canada, and that in this uncertain job context, it's absolutely essential for advancement within Canada's public service, or to, as we know, the Canadian government is becoming the ideal employer. This year, banking institutions and financial institutions don't have the same clout when it comes to hiring people. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Nadeau, I'd like to say three things. First, do you agree that second language learning should be encouraged at the elementary and secondary and high school level? So really, we have to start there. People have to be encouraged at that point, and then they can go on to a bilingual career in the public service. We know that education is under provincial jurisdiction, and we know that school boards are abolishing well-established programs, and we know what's happening in English-speaking provinces. My second point, do you agree that English-speaking students who have English as a mother tongue should go to French language programs where French is a first language in areas where French is a majority language in order to learn French, in order to fine-tune their French? Finally, if the federal government established the criteria according to which all members of the public service must be bilingual in order to get in, don't you think it would be an incentive for universities to create programs to enable people to enter the public service on that basis? I'll answer your last question first. I'm not comfortable with making bilingualism a necessary condition for entering the public service until all Canadians have equal access to quality training in the second language. I'm not just talking about English-speaking provinces. According to the Public Service Commission, for the first time, we see an increase in the demand for English language training for new French-speaking public servants who arrive in the public service without language capacity in English. So it's an issue on both sides of the language divide. It's easier to learn a language when you're very young, but you need encouragement throughout the process. I think that the federal government can create an incentive and send the message to universities. If learning a second language is valued by universities, well then high school students will be motivated to learn a second language. I often talk about inconsistency, and one element that is inconsistent is that often universities do not distinguish between a student who has learnt core French and a student who has learnt French in French immersion. I've spoken to high school students who have told me that their teachers told them, no, don't take the French immersion exam, take the core French exam. It's easier. You'll ace it. So that is an incentive to mediocrity. And universities have a program that's less demanding and lower quality. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Godin. Hello once again. This is part 2 of the meeting, not part 7. It's a 7-game series, in fact. We're trying to study post-secondary education, but the representatives of universities feel that, unless I understood them wrong, but that when students get to that level, it's too late. Learning a second language has to start earlier. So if tomorrow morning you can't get a job if you're not bilingual, yes, we'll have to put money into it. And then you talked about incentives. Couldn't the government start saying, listen, those who want to learn a second language, when you get to university, part of your studies to that effect will be paid for. That would be an incentive. Secondly, you could also give credit for language courses in universities. So students would be studying for their career, but they could also take language courses because they would be credit courses. Thirdly, the government should promote this from the beginning. If you intend to make it a condition for entering the public service, you should say, listen, that's where we're heading. You mentioned provincial jurisdiction in your report, so you put your foot in it yourself, but I'd like to use New Brunswick as an example. 350 English speakers demonstrated in front of the New Brunswick legislature saying, listen, we don't want our children to learn, to have to learn another language, when we know that throughout the world there are many countries where up to 6 languages are learnt. It's a benefit. It's an advantage. I can speak 2 languages, not that well, but I can communicate with people at least. So really, don't you think that in the case of New Brunswick, for example, the minister took a big step back. Now immersion will only start in grade 3, or rather grade 5. And when that kind of thing happens, the government does not understand that the public service is the main employer in the country. Schools are there for learning. That's where children learn. You have to learn a language in school and in university, not once you've gotten your job. Mr. Chair, I find the members' suggestions very interesting. I am reticent to say, as we say in English, that one size fits all. I think that there are a number of opportunities to learn a second language. I learned French when I was doing summer jobs at university. And it changed my life. It's that simple. I finished high school. And at that point, a French immersion didn't exist. So I would hesitate to say that there's only one way to proceed and only one way to learn the other language. What's important is to have the most opportunities possible.
I see that in Europe they have the Erasmus program. The European Community provides scholarships for university students to go spend a year in another university and learn another European language. But I'd ask Mr. Goldenberg to describe how many ways there are to learn a language, how many programs exist right now. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. At the university level, there are various ways to teach a second official language. Some, as the Commissioner mentioned, offer a whole range of programs, and others in a given discipline or other. Some universities have started providing second language programs that are linked to the vocabulary, terminology of a given field, so the student will be more interested in those specific. Some have started to offer courses to the students to continue the immersion process, similar to what is done at the high school level. Thank you for that list. We'll go ahead with Mr. Chong now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your report, Mr. Fraser.
And then a question. My suggestion is that one of the things that you might include in your final report is a greater elucidation of the need for the Government of Canada to have bilingual graduates from Canadian universities. It's not something that I see in this report. You have a section titled Need and Demand, so it might be a good area in which to slot the fact that we have a huge need for bilingual graduates from Canadian universities. So it's not just a stick issue, it's also a carrot issue. We are the largest employer in the country. We directly employ 260,000 public servants, and if you include the armed forces and crown corporations and federal agencies, that number is well into the 400,000 range. We're the largest hirer. We hire 10,000 people into the public service alone every year, the equivalent of a General Motors every single year. In fact, we hire more than the payroll of all the employees of General Motors every year. In fact, in the next decade, we are going to likely hire close to 100,000 new public servants. These are great jobs. They're well-paying jobs. They provide the stability that only a government can, and they include defined benefit pensions, which obviously is a big issue right now. But yet we're not getting the university graduates we need from Canadian universities. So I think that's certainly an area that needs to be really emphasized in the final report, because I think it will highlight to universities and to younger Canadians that there is this employer that needs them to come out of university with the knowledge of both official languages. So that's my comment. My question is, at this stage, I know you haven't finished your report, but at this stage, can you tell us the top one or two things that our government could do to get universities in Canada, get colleges, to produce a greater number of bilingual graduates? What are the number one or two things that we as a government can do to encourage that?
Well, first of all, let me reinforce what you said in your preliminary remarks, and I think that we will definitely take note of your suggestion to spell out the importance of the federal government as an employer of choice. And not only is the federal government going to be ever more an employer of choice in the current economic context, where all of a sudden being a policy analyst for the federal government may acquire a certain appeal that being a hedge fund manager no longer has, that there's going to be a continuing demand, as you say, for people who master both official languages. In terms of concrete things that the federal government can do, one of them is to much more clearly deliver that message to universities, to students, to parents, to secondary schools. One of the things that I think that people tend to neglect, and certainly I don't, is that often the key decision-making period is when adolescents are 14. That's when they are looking at what courses they need for high school, what is the university looking for, so that's when they are deciding, should I keep studying French? Should I take something else? What's the value added for the student who is 14, who is so that message has not got to be something that is limited when to the clerk of the Privy Council going and speaking to what's called the G13, the 13 major research universities. It's got to be a message that is delivered in as accessible a way as possible to families and students in grade 9 or 10.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, and we can certainly work in conjunction toward promoting a leadership role for the federal government in the second language continuum. Alors, c'est ce qui termine nos travaux pour ce matin.
So that puts an end to our work here this morning. Thank you for your appearance, Commissioner. We'll see you again next week for the examination of the report.